They expected blood. But not this silence, not this black skin, not the smell of decay wrapped in silk. When they entered the royal chamber that November morning, the light filtering through the stained glass was soft, almost sacred. But what lay in the center of the room was anything but divine. Queen Mary Tudor, once proud, once pious, sat motionless in her grand bed, the velvet sheets draped over her knees like the folds of a burial shroud. Her hands, once raised to bless and to condemn, now curled like withered petals at her sides. But it was not her stillness that made the servants stop breathing. It was her skin, charred, shrunken, dark as wrought beneath the surface of polished marble. It clung to her bones like damp parchment left too long in fire. Her lips were pulled back, exposing teeth in a way that resembled a snarl more than a smile. And her eyes, those once commanding Tudor eyes, were open, but they saw nothing. They say no one dared touch her for hours. One maid collapsed on the floor in prayer, whispering that the queen had been taken by demons. Another vomited behind the velvet curtains. The silence in that room was heavier than any scream. The air smelled of lavender and something fouler, like burnt silk, like spoiled wine, like death itself wearing a crown. How does a queen die like this? Why did her skin blacken? And what did she see in those final hours, before history wrote her off as nothing more than Bloody Mary? If you believe that behind every crown lies a curse, subscribe to our channel, where history bleeds through silence. She was born into grandeur, but her first breath already carried the weight of betrayal. Mary Tudor came into the world on a cold February day in 1516, the only surviving child of King Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. She was not born in a cradle of simplicity or warmth, but in a palace thick with prayers and expectations. England needed a son. Instead, it got her. A daughter with her mother's Spanish devotion and her father's Tudor blood. A combination destined for conflict. As a child, Mary was described as intelligent, gentle, unusually precocious. At 3, she played the virginals with angelic precision. At 7, she conversed in Latin with scholars. But behind those accomplishments was a soul already shaped by isolation. Henry, desperate for a male heir, began turning his gaze elsewhere. Mary, once the apple of his eye, became collateral in his ambitions. Then came Anne Boleyn. When Henry defied the Pope and broke from Rome to marry Anne, the world Mary knew collapsed. Her mother was banished, reduced to the title of Dowager Princess of Wales, and Mary was declared illegitimate. Her royal household was disbanded. She was forbidden to see Catherine. And in a cruel stroke of irony, she was ordered to serve in the household of her half-sister Elizabeth, the child Henry had with Anne. Imagine the humiliation. A princess, now a bastard, forced to serve a baby who had taken her place. No longer addressed as Princess Mary, she was now simply the Lady Mary. Her clothes were cheapened, her tutors dismissed, her titles stripped, but what they could not take from her was her faith. Catholicism was not just her religion, it was her spine, her comfort, her revenge. Her mother's rosary became her anchor. Each Hail Mary whispered in the dark was a promise. One day, she would be restored. One day, God would remember her. But the girl who once dined beside kings now ate alone, shadowed by fear. She knew she was watched. Every letter she wrote, every priest she visited, every glance toward Rome. It was all recorded, and yet she kept praying, not out of hope, but out of duty, out of defiance. The hatred for Elizabeth began not as rivalry, but as survival. Elizabeth was the child who had everything Mary lost: legitimacy, love, a future. And Mary would never forget that. The years passed, and Mary became a woman molded by absence, of affection, of trust, of power. Her body remained in England, but her heart belonged to another realm, one carved by grief and doctrine. Her letters to her mother remained formal, reverent, but behind the ink was a desperation only the exiled can recognize. When Catherine died in 1536, Mary was not allowed to attend the funeral. No farewell, no closure, just silence again. Henry demanded she recognize his supremacy over the church and accept her illegitimacy. For years, she resisted, but hunger, isolation, and the threat of death wore her down. She signed, not out of agreement, but out of survival. It was the first of many surrenders that would haunt her later. The court called it submission. Mary called it sin. Even in her forced compliance, she did not forget. When Anne Boleyn fell, beheaded after her own scandal, Mary did not rejoice openly, but within her chambers. A rosary was kissed with trembling lips. One enemy gone, a score quietly settled. Still, the throne was not hers. Edward, the son of Henry and his third wife, Jane Seymour, was next in line, a sickly boy, but male, and therefore anointed by the logic of their age. Mary played the loyal sister, but she watched, observed, endured. Every cough Edward made in public was a whisper of fate leaning in her direction. She was not the daughter Henry wanted, not the sister the kingdom preferred, not the heir England imagined. But she was still a Tudor, and she was still alive. They had tried to erase her, with proclamations, with exile, with shame. But Mary understood something they didn't. Power is not given. It is reclaimed, piece by piece, in the dark, with blood and memory. Her faith, though bruised, did not break. Her love for her mother became a weapon. Her hatred for Elizabeth, a compass. She was not merely a woman of God. She was a woman waiting for God to deliver justice. And justice, as she saw it, would one day sit upon a throne with her name carved into the wood. The kingdom trembled when Edward VI died. Only 15, his body had given out before his crown ever truly fit. But even in death, he tried to erase his half-sister Mary. Under the influence of Protestant nobles, he signed a devise for the succession, bypassing both Mary and Elizabeth in favor of Lady Jane Grey, his cousin, young, educated, and more importantly, Protestant. It was a paper throne. Mary, then 37, was not supposed to matter anymore. She had been contained, watched, politically declawed, but they had forgotten what a woman remembers in exile. She had spent decades being erased, daughter of a disgraced queen, bastard in a royal court, relic of a dying faith. And yet, when the moment came, she did not hesitate. As Jane Grey was proclaimed queen in London, Mary rode out to East Anglia, raising her standard like a ghost returning from the grave. Nobles hesitated, soldiers paused, but the people remembered. The real daughter of Henry VIII, the one with Tudor blood and Catholic fire. Villagers and barons alike rallied. Within days, thousands stood behind her. Jane Grey's reign lasted just 9 days. Mary entered London not as a fragile woman, but as a storm cloaked in velvet. Bells rang, crowds wept, and beneath the cheers, fear took root. Because England knew what came next. A queen not merely to rule, but to restore, to punish, to redeem. Her first acts were symbolic but sharp. The Catholic Mass was restored. Priests who had hidden were summoned from exile. The Pope was written to, as if England had never broken away. To Mary, this was not rebellion, it was resurrection. But the crown was heavy, and loneliness set in quickly. She believed marriage could save her, not just her soul, but her legacy. She needed an heir, a Catholic heir, and in Philip of Spain, the son of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, she saw both salvation and alliance. He was royal, pious, and politically potent, but he was also a man raised among conquest, not affection, and he did not come to England for love. The people hated the match. They feared Spanish domination. Rebellions sparked. Sir Thomas Wyatt led thousands against the Union. Mary stood firm. She saw in Philip a divine answer, not a foreign yoke. They married in 1554. It was a ceremony cloaked in gold and incense, but beneath the surface, ice was already forming. Philip spoke little English. He smiled rarely, and when he touched her, it was duty, not desire. Still, she hoped. When her belly began to swell, the court held its breath. At last, a miracle, proof that God had not forsaken her. The kingdom prepared for a royal birth. Prayers were sung, gowns stitched, names whispered in the halls. Mary moved with renewed purpose, one hand always resting over her womb. Letters were sent to Rome, to Paris, to every corner of Europe. England would have a Catholic heir. But as the months passed, the silence returned. No baby kicked, no labor came. The midwives watched, helpless. Then came the whispers. Perhaps it was a phantom pregnancy, or worse, a tumor. Mary refused to believe it. She clung to the dream like scripture. Even when her body betrayed her, she insisted God had a plan. Philip grew distant. He spent more time in council chambers than beside her bed. And then, quietly, he left for Spain. He did not take her with him. Alone, betrayed by both flesh and husband, Mary turned to the only certainty left: fire. If she could not give birth to a child, she would give birth to a purified England. The heretics had grown bold during Edward's reign. Protestant pamphlets spread like plague. Churches had been stripped bare, and Mary, the Catholic queen, would not allow it. The burnings began. It started with bishops, then theologians, then simple men and women who dared pray in English. They were marched through London in chains, tied to posts in Smithfield, Oxford, Canterbury. Flames devoured them as crowds looked on, some in horror, some in praise. And Mary watched from afar, not with glee, but with grim resolve. To her, it was not cruelty, it was cleansing. Each scream a hymn, each ash a sacrament. It was England that named her Bloody Mary. She never called herself that. She called herself a servant of God. And yet, even she could not deny the toll. The air grew thicker with fear. Counselors whispered, subjects plotted, and always, always, the shadow of Elizabeth lingered. The girl who smiled with the hair of Anne Boleyn and the silence of survival. Mary had climbed the throne through iron and prayer. She had restored the old faith with blood. But now, she looked around and saw only empty pews, smoldering ruins, and a crown that weighed heavier by the hour. The higher she rose, the darker the sky became. And somewhere in that growing void, she began to realize England might never love her, only fear her. He returned, but not for her. Philip stepped once more upon English soil in 1557, not as a husband rekindling love, but as a king demanding allegiance. Spain was at war with France, and he needed Mary's support. He brought with him no warmth, no promises, no child to hold, just treaties, just shadows. She welcomed him nonetheless. In her eyes, this was still marriage, still sacred, still a union worth defending. But the palace walls betrayed her. Courtiers bowed, but with stiff spines. Ambassadors smiled with veiled contempt. Her own council murmured in half-lighted rooms. They had learned to navigate without her. They had learned to wait. Elizabeth remained, quiet, watchful, dangerously composed. Her presence in court was like a candle in a locked chamber, flickering but never extinguished. The more Mary faltered, the more Elizabeth glowed. Foreign dignitaries requested audiences with the younger sister. Not the reigning queen. Portraits of Elizabeth began to appear in secret, eyes bright, cheeks soft with promise. Mary knew what they whispered, that she was the past, and Elizabeth was the England yet to come. The Parliament grew reluctant. Mary's efforts to restore papal authority met with resistance dressed as caution. When she pushed for stronger laws against heresy, voices once loyal fell silent. No one dared challenge her outright, but silence was louder than rebellion. The court had grown colder. The rooms no longer carried her scent, only the faint echo of her footsteps. Even the tapestries seemed to hang with less reverence. Then came the rumors that her womb had never held life, only disease, that her soul had been blackened by the fires she lit, that God, in his mercy, had turned his face away. A merchant was arrested for claiming the Queen's blood ran thick with Spanish ink, that she would die childless and damned. But even as he was dragged to the tower, others repeated the words in safer corners. The people began to pray for her death, not out of hatred, but out of exhaustion. Her own body became a cage. She no longer trusted her reflection. The face staring back was pale, drawn, hollow beneath the eyes. Each step in the palace corridors felt longer, the chill of the stone seeping into her bones. She wore heavier garments, not out of fashion, but to conceal the trembling. Her hands, once steady in the act of royal blessing, now shook when lifting a goblet. Courtiers noticed, but no one spoke. Philip departed again, this time with fewer words, fewer farewells. He left behind a queen without a husband, a throne without a future, and a silence no prayer could fill. His letters, when they came, were formal, as if addressed to a monarch, not a wife. She read them anyway. sometimes aloud, sometimes in whispers, as if willing warmth from the ink. Elizabeth's shadow grew longer. Some nights, Mary dreamed of her sister seated on the throne, laughing with the Spanish crown cast into the fire. Other nights, she imagined Elizabeth's coronation robes stained with the blood of martyrs. She could not decide which image tormented her more. Yet despite everything, she could not bring herself to sign Elizabeth's death warrant. Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps, in the hollow space once reserved for love, there was still a sliver of kinship too stubborn to kill. The clergy no longer knelt as deeply. Some even refused to mention her name in sermons. The Vatican, once eager to support her mission, began redirecting its interest elsewhere. Rome had grown impatient. The English mission was bleeding influence. And Mary, their chosen vessel, was now a flickering flame. She received fewer emissaries, fewer blessings. The silence from Rome was worse than excommunication. Inside the palace, she kept fewer companions. Her ladies-in-waiting rotated more frequently. Some were dismissed without explanation. Others simply vanished from the record. Those who remained learned to move with quiet feet, to smile when addressed, to never mention Philip or Elizabeth unless asked directly. Mary, once surrounded by ceremony and reverence, now dined alone. She did not cry, she prayed. Even as the halls echoed with her solitude, she believed in her purpose. God does not abandon his anointed, she whispered each night. He tests them. He refines them through fire. But the court no longer believed she was being refined. They believed she was being punished. It began with a fever, not violent, not sudden, but persistent, like a whisper that refused to leave. The physicians spoke in riddles, cloaked in Latin and uncertainty. They bled her. They purged her. They applied leeches to her back and temples, believing the heat would drain away with the blood. But the heat stayed. It sank into her bones. It curled in her belly. It crawled beneath her skin. Her face lost color. Her lips dried and cracked, despite the rosewater compresses laid gently by trembling hands. She could no longer walk without help. Her ankles swelled. Her appetite vanished. Yet what alarmed the servants most was not the fragility of her frame, but the deepening color of her flesh. It darkened slowly, first at the fingers, then at the tips of her ears, the soles of her feet. Her skin, once pale and soft beneath the crown, took on a strange tint, like parchment scorched at the edges. Some days, it looked bruised. Other days, charred. The court whispered of poison. The physicians insisted on illness, but no one could name it. Some suspected liver failure. Others whispered of ovarian rot, the cursed legacy of a womb that had never borne fruit. Whatever it was, it made her body betray her more each day. The smell was faint at first, masked by incense and oils. But then came a staleness in the air, one that clung to the drapes, the pillows, the very breath of her ladies. No one mentioned it aloud, not even when they began to keep the windows open at night, despite the cold. Sleep abandoned her. When her eyes closed, the darkness twisted. She spoke aloud in Latin, half prayers, half confessions. She saw her mother standing by the window. She reached out to her father, his face melting into shadow. She asked after Philip, but only when no one was near. Sometimes she laughed. The sound was thin and strange, like the creak of a rusted hinge. She refused to be moved from her chamber. The room, once golden and rich with tapestries, dimmed with each day. The fire was kept burning, yet the cold persisted. Candles flickered but did not warm. She insisted on hearing mass from her bed, her voice barely more than breath as she mouthed the responses. And every morning, she placed her hand on her belly, as if the lie could still become truth. The physicians began to wear gloves when they approached her. They claimed it was to prevent infection, but their eyes told a different story. They feared her, not as a queen, but as something touched by rot. Her touch lingered too long. Her breath came with effort. Her body seemed to sag under its own weight, as though some unseen force were dragging her downward into the bed itself. Her voice grew thinner, reduced to murmurs. She called out to people who were no longer alive. A bishop long dead. A childhood maid. Once, she whispered to Elizabeth, asking her to kneel. No one responded. The room remained still. The ladies in waiting, now fewer and silent, exchanged glances but said nothing. It had become a chamber of ghosts. Each night, she asked for the same thing, her mother's rosary. It arrived in a small velvet pouch, the silver links tarnished, the crucifix worn smooth by years of desperate hands. She clutched it as if it were a lifeline, rubbing the beads until her skin cracked. When she prayed, her words blurred together, less like language and more like longing. She no longer remembered entire verses, but she repeated the same names: Catherine, Philip, Christ, Mary, over and over, as if layering them might build a wall between her and the thing crawling inside her chest. The palace grew quieter. Fewer visitors came. News from outside the chamber was filtered and softened. She no longer heard the bells of London, no longer felt the rhythm of the court. The world beyond her curtains might as well have vanished. The servants began to rotate hourly. The stench had grown too strong for long stays. They brought flowers, burned herbs, sprinkled vinegar on the floorboards. Still, the air remained heavy. Some claimed the scent resembled burnt meat. Others said it was closer to damp soil and old wine. Mary herself said nothing of it. She simply prayed louder. One night, a girl barely 15, assigned to bring broth, fainted upon entering the chamber. When she was revived, she wept and claimed she had seen the Queen's face glowing in the dark, eyes wide, mouth open, a voice murmuring in Latin that was not her own. The girl was dismissed the next morning. Mary never asked why. By now, even her bones hurt, not from strain or illness, but from remembrance. Her body had become a reliquary of loss. Each joint ached with disappointment. Each breath reminded her of the silence left behind by Philip's absence, her mother's death, the child who never was. And still, she held the rosary. And still, no one touched her bare skin. The night before she died, no one entered the room. Not the physicians, not the priests, not even her most trusted maid. Only one candle remained lit beside the bed, its flame low, swaying with the drafts that slipped through the heavy stone walls. The fire in the hearth had been allowed to fade. The air was damp, still, and almost reverent, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Mary lay against a stack of embroidered pillows, barely moving, Her eyes were open, but unfocused. She no longer whispered prayers. Her lips moved, but no sound came. On the table beside her, the old rosary rested in a shallow silver bowl, as though it too had grown weary of being touched. The beads were warm from her fingers, their silver darkened by sweat and fever. She reached for the cup of wine. Not much, just a few shallow sips. Enough to wet her lips, to feel something pass through her one last time. Her hands trembled. The goblet nearly tipped, but she steadied it and drank. Then, slowly, she placed her hand on her belly. Fingers splayed over the place she had once imagined life would grow. She held it there, unmoving, for longer than an hour. Outside, the city was quiet. London slept. She blinked slowly. Her breath was shallow. No servant heard a gasp. No priest heard a confession. There were no screams, no death rattle, no final call for God. Only a slow stillness, and then nothing. The candle beside her flickered once, as if startled, and went out. At dawn, they knocked, but no answer came. The door creaked open with hesitation. The scent met them first, thick and unmistakable, decay laced with lavender, something rich and wrong that clung to the air like a second skin. The room was dim, curtains drawn, the hearth cold. They stepped inside as if entering a crypt. She was sitting upright. The body had stiffened sometime during the night. Her head leaned slightly to one side, eyes partially closed, mouth open in a frozen exhale. Her hands rested where she had placed them, one on her lap, the other still pressed lightly against her abdomen. But it was her skin that silenced the room. It had darkened, not the sallow gray of the dead, but a deeper hue, almost black, around the neck, beneath the chin, spreading down the arms and legs like ink spilled on parchment. The fingertips had shriveled. The lips had turned a bluish violet. In places, the flesh looked burned. One maid whispered that she must have been taken by fire in her sleep. No one touched her. The bishop crossed himself and stepped back. The chief physician turned away, muttering something about tissue necrosis, perhaps gangrene, perhaps a consequence of liver failure. But his voice wavered. None of them had seen this before. Not in a queen, not in anyone. There were no signs of violence, no blood, no struggle. Just the color, the stillness, the silence, and the scent that now seemed to fill the corridor. They wrapped her in silk as gently as they could. Some say they burned the sheets afterward. Others say they buried them in a quiet corner of the palace gardens. The records are unclear, as if history itself flinched at the memory. One of the youngest maids, with trembling hands, closed the queen's eyelids. She said nothing, but afterward, she confessed to another servant that she felt something move beneath the skin, like heat or breath, or something unwilling to let go. Outside, the city woke slowly, and the people heard only this. They found her skin blackened. They buried her quickly, not in haste, but in avoidance. The Queen was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, her tomb austere, her name carved in Latin like a half-finished prayer. The court disguised its discomfort with formality. Bells were rung, prayers were read, but no one truly grieved, no child cried, no crowd collapsed in sorrow. There were no gasps of history closing, no sense of something holy passing, only relief. The room where she died was sealed, the curtains removed, the tapestries burned, the bed dismantled. They said it was for cleanliness, to rid the space of the odor. But no one returned, not even the cleaning maids. The air remained thick. It clung to the walls with an invisible residue, a blend of lavender, wax, and something fouler, something that could not be named. Some claimed it smelled of burnt meat. Others said it was like damp stone, rot and incense stitched together. Her chamber became a ghost. Elizabeth rose swiftly. The younger sister now crowned not by blood, but by the people's yearning to forget. Her entry into London was greeted by petals, trumpets, faces turned upward with hope. The nation shifted like a body rolling away from a nightmare. Mary's portraits were removed, her name mentioned only in caution. History, as it tends to do, began to edit. The fires she lit became shadows. The faith she bled for became error, her voice erased. But some things refuse erasure. The priests still crossed themselves when passing her tomb. Not out of reverence, but out of unease. Servants assigned to the lower crypts whispered of footsteps that came without cause, of drafts in windless air, of rosary beads left in places no one had touched. A bishop once swore he heard Latin murmured from within the stone itself. He said it was not prayer, it was warning. They called her Bloody Mary, not a queen, not a woman, a ghost of fire and regret, shaped by the mouths of those who never touched her suffering. In taverns, they turned her into a drink, in nursery rhymes, into a curse, in popular memory, into something grotesque. They spoke of her as if she had never knelt beside her mother's bed, as if she had never walked silently through court corridors with shame in her eyes, as if she had not been a daughter, a sister, a woman who once believed herself chosen. Time favored Elizabeth, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, a monarch untouched by husband or child, cloaked in myth before her flesh began to wither. Under her reign, England flourished, poetry bloomed, oceans were crossed, enemies fell. Her image adorned coins, portraits, dreams, and beside her shining legacy, Mary diminished not as tragedy, but as caution. Her piety became hysteria, her longing, delusion, her strength, tyranny. They stripped her down until all that remained was fire and failure, her name written in soot, spoken in fear. Yet beneath the abbey, something resists, because truth has weight. And Mary Tudor, for all her blood and sorrow, carried that truth into death. She was not the first woman to bleed for a throne, but she was the first to wear one. She ruled in a world that punished obedience and mocked suffering. She loved a man who used her, prayed to a God who gave no answer, and bore a crown that never welcomed her name. And yet, she never surrendered. Not even when her skin turned black and the servants turned away. There are places where the smell has never left. A guard once refused to patrol the corridor near her former chamber, claiming he saw a dark figure seated upright where no chair had been. He said it wasn't her face that unnerved him. It was the stillness. As if the woman had never left, merely waited. Some dream of her. They wake with ash on their tongues, fingertips numb, as though touched by something neither living nor dead. Others, passing her tomb, swear they feel watched. A pressure in the air, a coldness that enters through the breath. The throne remembers. It remembers the hands that clenched in agony, the mouth that whispered Latin through blood, the silence after the final breath. It remembers the first woman to rule, not in myth, but in flesh. It remembers what it took from her, and it remembers what it left behind. Because a crown worn in agony does not vanish. It stains. If her story still lingers on your skin like ash, then stay with us. Because the throne never forgets those it devours. So if her story still haunts you, if the silence in that chamber still echoes somewhere in your bones, don't look away. Because this is only one ghost among many. Subscribe to the Torture Throne and step deeper into the shadows of power, betrayal, and the forgotten blood beneath every crown. History doesn't whisper, it waits.